Hello, and welcome to Transgender Cultural Responsiveness for Legal Professionals, brought to you by the Center on Colfax. My name is Ryann Peyton, and I am the former legal director for the Center on Colfax and a current board member. In my practice as a lawyer, I focus on LGBT civil rights and family law. Today, we're going to be talking about how to be a good ally to your transgender clients. Our agenda is going to assist you in developing a better understanding of the trans communities and improve your ability to serve the transgender and gender diverse communities in your work as a legal professional. We're going to begin with some basic terminology to create a shared language as we examine topics such as basic sexual orientation terms and gender identity terms. Then we'll get into the barriers that transgender people face in accessing health and legal services. And we'll finish with best practices and practical tips for working with the trans communities in an inclusive way. Our goal is for you to develop a working knowledge of key terms and concepts related to transgender people, an understanding of the difference between items such as sexual orientation, gender identity, and the fluidity of both. We want you to gain a familiarity with the major healthcare and legal disparities facing transgender people. And we want you to have an increased comfort level in communicating with and using language related to the transgender community. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the Center on Colfax. The center is Colorado's oldest and largest LGBTQ community center. We serve over 47,000 people annually through the work of 19 staff members and 550 community volunteers. Our programs range from youth to elder, families, the trans community, legal and training, and our range consulting program, which trains workplaces on how to create LGBTQ inclusivity. Finally, we put on Denver Pride Fest every year in Civic Center Park with about 300,000 of our closest friends. We appreciate your support of the Center on Colfax and hope to continue working with you in a broader capacity. So let's begin with some basic LGBT terminology. We're going to focus our discussion today on the concepts of sexual orientation and gender identity. Many people avoid talking about these concepts because despite the fact that every person has a sexual orientation and a gender identity, they may not understand the distinction between them and incorrectly assume that these concepts are reserved solely for the LGBT community alone. Sexual orientation. This is something we all have. Everyone has an orientation because it's really who someone is attracted to sexually or romantically. For some people, that's a different gender. For some, it's the same gender. For some, it's both genders. For some, it's all genders. And for others, it's no gender at all. But each one of us has a sexual orientation, and throughout our life, sometimes this orientation can be fluid. For some folks, sexual orientation never changes, but for others, they may go back and forth between a different orientation, and for some, they may never feel as though they have any attraction toward any type of gender. But it's something that we all have, and it's really just basically who we're sexually or romantically attracted to. And these terms are probably familiar for most people. These are the terms around sexual orientation that you hear most often in communication. Heterosexual is someone who's attracted only to someone of another gender. Sometimes we refer to these folks as straight. Lesbian is a female identified person who is attracted only to another female identified person. Gay is a male identified person who is attracted only to another male identified person. Although it's important to note that some female identified people will use the term gay and lesbian interchangeably. So it depends on who you're speaking with, but for the most part, we associate lesbian with female identified people and gay with male identified people. And then finally, bisexual is someone who's attracted to another gender or genders. This could be the same gender or a different gender or both. Now, we've intentionally put on this slide both genders or not both genders, and instead saying generally another gender, and we'll discuss more about that in a few moments. But for a long time, bisexual was really relegated to folks who were attracted to both genders, male and female. But as we're going to discuss later on, gender is not just binary in terms of male and female. And so when we're talking about bisexual individuals, we want to expand our definition of gender to include more than just both male and female, to all genders or another gender. Other terms around sexual orientation that may be new to you include pansexual. This is someone who's attracted to another person regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or biological sex. So they're not really looking at gender identity or sexual orientation when they define who they're attracted to. Asexual, someone who doesn't have an attraction to another person really at all. Questioning, this is someone who may be exploring their sexual orientation, unsure about who they might be attracted to and attempting to figure that out. And then queer. Queer is really an umbrella term for all sexual and gender minorities who don't identify as heterosexual or who don't identify as cisgender. We'll talk about that term cisgender in a few more moments. But a quick note about the word queer. For some folks, the word queer is still quite a derogatory term. As we give these trainings to workplaces, many times people raise their hand and say, well, I thought queer was a bad word. Well, it depends on who you're talking to. It's very much a generational term at this point in time. So for the younger LGBTQ plus generation, queer is a term that they've taken back. They have made this term a more inclusive term to really identify folks on a sexual orientation level and a gender identity level. And they utilize the term queer in a lot of their daily conversation and also as a self-identifier. For instance, I myself identify as queer. That being said, if you're speaking with an older generation, baby boomer or older, this term may still have a lot of derogatory connotation. And you won't hear them using the term queer quite as often. And if you were to use it with them unexpectedly, it's possible that they would take offense. So the good guiding rule around the word queer is that if someone's using it with you, feel free to use it with them. But if they're not using it with you, either ask how they feel about the term or don't use it at all. That's a good way to make sure that you're not offending anyone in the use of the word queer and using it appropriately. Okay, so sexual orientation we've covered now. So that is really just who you are sexually or romantically attracted to. Now, the other term we want to get to know here is gender identity. Again, this is something we all have, and it's really our internal sense of being male, female, or something else. Gender is a social construct, and it's been traditionally based on the two sexes, male and female, and has traditionally been a binary concept as well. So male, female in terms of biological sex usually translates into man or woman when it comes to gender identity. But we know now that gender is broader and more fluid than that binary concept of male or female. We also know that one's internal concept of gender identity does not always align with their biological sex. And we're going to talk more about that later. That's really what deciphers the trans community from this cisgender community. And finally, gender identity is something that's not always able to be seen or deciphered in somebody else. Because it's so much of your internal sense of being, for a lot of folks, gender identity is assumed. It's hard to tell someone's gender identity simply by looking at them. So when you're thinking about gender identity, think about when you get up in the morning and get out of bed and decide how you're going to dress for the day, how you're going to present yourself for the day. A lot of that is going to be determined by your gender identity, how you feel about your gender. Do you feel masculine? Do you feel feminine? Do you identify more as a man, more as a woman, a little bit of both, in between, neither? All of those things go into your gender identity. And sometimes that'll be associated with the sex that you were assigned at birth, and sometimes it won't be. And we're going to have a much broader conversation here about the concept of gender identity as we get to know this term better. Cisgender. This is a term that you may be hearing more often, but for many folks, this is a new term. Essentially, what it means is someone whose internal understanding of their gender matches the body they were born with and their sex assigned at birth. So for instance, a cisgender person is someone who was assigned female at birth, has a body with reproductive systems and organs that are female, and whose gender identity is that of a woman or female identified. So that is someone who's cisgender because everything aligns. Cis is really a Latin term for in alignment or in align. And so when biological sex and gender matches together, is in alignment, we would call that cisgender. And the majority of the US population would be classified as cisgender. As you can see from this chart and in the next chart we're going to talk about, approximately 99.4% of Americans identify as cisgender. 94% of that 99% identify as heterosexual and cisgender. So here we're seeing that intersection between sexual orientation and gender identity. So they're two different concepts. And so we want to make sure that when we're talking about gender identity, we're not inherently also talking about sexual orientation. It's okay to mention them as sort of parallel ideas, but one does not necessarily beget another. So as you can see in this chart, 94% identify as straight or heterosexual and cisgender, and about 6% identify as LGB and cisgender. So what does this tell you? It tells you that of the 99% who identify as cisgender in the US population, about 6 of them are cisgender and gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So you can be cisgender and be gay, lesbian, bisexual, and you can be cisgender and be heterosexual. Again, gender identity and sexual orientation are not necessarily related or indicative of one another. In fact, the majority of LGB folks identify as cisgender. Transgender, on the other hand, is someone whose gender identity, expression, or behavior is different from those typically associated with their assigned sex at birth. So we have cis, meaning in alignment, and then trans, essentially not in alignment. So these are folks whose gender identity does not align squarely with the sex assigned at birth. So this would be someone who has a sex assigned at birth as female, but whose gender identity might be that of male, man, male identified, or gender queer, something in between, but something that is not in alignment with that female sex assigned at birth. It's important to note that transgender is really an umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity and expression or behavior is different. A lot of times we associate the word transgender with our concept of transgender that we've received from the media or from our interactions with others in the transgender community. And what we're going to see in a few moments is how much of an umbrella term transgender really is, and that it encompasses not just those folks who would probably more so identify as transsexual, those who do feel as though their sex assigned at birth is not aligned at all with their gender identity. In fact, it's opposite, but instead is an umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity, expression, or behavior is different. So more on that in a moment. But I want to turn to this graph here where you can see that it's a much smaller segment of the population that identifies as transgender, about 0.6%. But I would argue that this number is unrealistically low, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One, we as a society have not yet figured out the best way to ask whether someone identifies as transgender. And if we do ask it, traditionally we don't ask it in a way that helps us separate out those who maybe identify more as gender queer or maybe as non-binary or other terms instead of just truly transgender folks. The other reason I think this number is low is because a lot of folks in the trans community are afraid of reporting their status on a demographic form, whether that be a government census form, whether that be a workplace form, a health form. They don't want to out themselves because they don't feel confident that that information will be protected. And so there's probably a large percentage of underreporting happening. So even though we see here that only 0.6% of the US population identifies as transgender, that number is most likely quite larger than that. So let's look more closely at this concept of transgender as we go forward here. So once again, it's important to note that sexual orientation and gender identity is not a related concept, in that one does not beget the other. And if I go back to this chart here just for a moment, I want to point out that if we were to separate out here those who identify as transgender and heterosexual, you would see that that's actually a possibility. Some people believe that it's not possible to be transgender and also straight, but it is. It absolutely is possible to be transgender and straight, just as it's possible to be cisgender and LGB. So again, keep those concepts in your mind as two separate ideas. So to understand the concept of transgender a little bit more, we have to start with the concept of biological sex. Once again, something that everybody has. In a medical term really used to refer to whether you are male, female, or intersex. And we look at different aspects of your body to make that determination. Sometimes it's anatomical, sometimes it's chromosomal or hormonal, sometimes it's a combination of the three. But when you were born, a medical professional took a look at you and decided on the spot what sex you were. And if they couldn't tell from looking at your anatomy, there may have been more testing done at a chromosomal or hormonal level, but ultimately somebody made that designation for you. And that designation has followed you throughout the course of your life. Think about all of the places where your sex assigned at birth shows up: on your driver's license, on your passport, on marriage certificates, on birth certificates, on death certificates. Really everything about who you are in relation to the world is based on this designation at birth of what your sex is. Sometimes it falls very strictly into the male or female category, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there is maybe a combination of anatomy and chromosomes that don't really match. Or sometimes it's not entirely clear what anatomy a person may have or what chromosomal makeup a person may have. And in that case, those folks might be assigned intersex at birth. And you may hear this term more often now as there's more public discussion about how intersex folks should be recognized in our society. In fact, there was an article just recently about legislation in California preventing parents from taking medical steps to essentially fix intersex babies and force them into one category or another without their consent. And so we do see a small percentage of the population who is intersex, and that is becoming more likely to be a classification that you will see on birth certificates as well as on driver's licenses, passports, etc. But that's what that term means. We used to use the term hermaphrodite. We don't use that anymore. We're going to talk more about that later. But essentially, your biological sex is the sex that you were assigned at birth. And then what happens as you grow is that you start to take on a gender. And oftentimes in society, we confuse the concept of sex with the concept of gender. As I mentioned earlier, gender is really a social construct and has nothing to do, essentially with the sex assigned at birth, except that from a social standpoint, we've all essentially agreed that your sex assigned at birth should determine your gender. So for most folks, when a baby is born, depending on their sex assigned at birth, the parents of that child will raise that baby within the gender constructs of that sex. So this is where little boys wear blue, little girls wear pink, girls are sugar and spice and everything nice. Boys, play with trucks and get dirty. And we just have different ways of raising children based on that sex assigned at birth. But because we don't really understand, gender in the correct way, for a lot of children, they're raised in a gender construct that's based solely on their anatomy and not at all on how they feel about their internal sense of gender or their gender identity. And so that's how we start to understand this distinction between sex and gender, in that, yes, sex is what you've been assigned at birth, but gender identity is something you develop from very early on in your life. And for some people, that gender identity matches. They're happy to wear blue because they feel like they are a boy. And for some, it's not. They want to wear pink because they actually feel more like a girl, even though their body or their anatomy says that they're a male. So in addition to gender identity, which is that internal sense of gender, we also have gender expression. Again, something that everybody has, but this is really how we all represent to the world or express our gender identity to others. And so think about the clothing that you wear, the way you cut your hair, whether you grow facial hair, whether you wear makeup, how you use your voice, the name that you might take on in your life. But really, gender expression is what you see about someone's gender. And even though that this is the part of gender identity that you can see, it's important not to make assumptions about one's gender identity based on their gender expression. So if you're in a room and you happen to see somebody wearing a tie, I think most people will automatically assume that that person is a man or identifies as male. And that may be true, but it's important to remember not to make assumptions that the way that folks express their gender may align with their biological sex and or their gender identity, or it may not. Similarly, if you were to see someone in a room wearing a dress or a skirt, you might assume that they identify as female or identify as a woman. And that may be true, but it also may not be true. So remember that gender expression is often what we see about gender, but just because that's someone's way of expressing gender, it's important not to make assumptions about which gender they may ultimately identify as. So these two terms, gender binary and gender diverse, these terms we're seeing more and more in popular culture and in discussion around gender, because it's showing us how the conversation about gender is really shifting away from the notion of gender binary to the notion of gender diversity. So the gender binary is simply the idea that there are only two genders, male or female. And if you think back to most of the demographic forms you filled out over the course of your life, those are probably the only two options that you were given. Are you male or female? And so those who ascribe to the gender binary thought process really believe that every person is either male or female. You simply have to choose. On the other hand, we have this concept of gender diversity. And this is a term that really describes an array of labels that people may apply when talking about their gender identity or their gender expression and the ways that they conform or don't conform to the different norms and stereotypes of gender. So this aspect or this concept of gender diversity is really gaining a lot of traction. Again, goes back to the fluidity of gender. And how we're learning more and more about the way that gender might ebb and flow over the course of someone's life. And to put people into the box of male or female into these binary options really doesn't work for the vast majority of folks. Because it's possible that most people at any given time in their life may feel a little bit gender diverse. We know that many children tend to feel a lot of gender diversity, and it's not until they're forced to take on a specific gender role that that diversity lessens over time. And so what we're seeing is a lot of folks choosing a more diverse way of thinking about gender and coming up with new names, ideas, and labels to describe their own gender. And that really leads us back to the concept of transgender being an umbrella term. An umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity or expression doesn't align with their sex assigned at birth. And this is where you see the concept of gender identity really play out here. So what we have here are two umbrellas. On the left-hand side, we have a transgender umbrella, and this umbrella is really encompasses any individual whose gender identity doesn't match their gender at birth. And on the right-hand side, we have the gender non-conforming umbrella. And this really encompasses any individual who crosses over or challenges their society's traditional gender roles or expressions. And when you look under those umbrellas, you're going to see a number of terms, some of which may be new to you, some of which you may have seen before. But it's important to understand the difference between the two. So on the right-hand side, on the gender nonconforming, you see a lot of folks who are probably more so challenging gender expression in a lot of ways. You see drag queen, drag king, cross-dresser, gender bender. These are folks who don't identify as transgender, who likely wouldn't say that their gender identity is not in alignment with their sex assigned at birth, but who would say, we like to push the boundaries and break the rules of stereotypes when it comes to how we express gender. So these might be, women who dress up in drag and wear mustaches and men's clothing. It might be men who dress up in drag and wear women's clothing. Folks who wear clothing of the opposite sex. Folks who just appear, present to the world as more feminine or more masculine than their sex assigned at birth. So more gender nonconforming, you're going to see here a lot of gender expression that just challenges gender roles and other things. But on the left-hand side, under the transgender umbrella, this is where you see a lot of folks whose gender identity really is in conflict in some way to their biological sex. So here we have, transsexual, which is, it's still a medical term. It's the term that would be used for transgender folks who truly do need to change sex, in that their biological sex assigned at birth is female, and they change that sex to male. We have intersex folks there. We have non-gender or non-gendered folks there. We have gender queer folks there, non-binary folks. So anybody really whose gender identity is not in alignment in some way. It may be full blown. My sex assigned at birth was female, and I am male and wish to confirm that. Or it could be something like gender queer, where you have folks who say, well, my sex assigned at birth is female, but my gender identity is a little bit both male and female, and so it's not quite in alignment. So the takeaway from this slide is really to remember that transgender as a term is an umbrella term encompassing all of these folks, even though not all of them would identify as a transgender individual or part of the trans community. So thinking of transgender as that umbrella term, and then remembering that what falls under that umbrella is both a challenge of gender expression, and also gender identity and sex assigned at birth not being in alignment. And all of those types of people really fall under that umbrella term of transgender. Okay, so now that we have a shared language around what transgender really means, and all of the different types of folks that fall under that umbrella, and understanding the distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity, I want to get into the health and legal disparities that this community faces. And when we use the term transgender here, we are talking about probably the traditional transgender community that you're used to seeing, but also folks whose gender identity may not be in alignment with their biological sex. So transgender folks report many barriers to receiving culturally responsive healthcare and legal services because of their gender identity. And just some statistics here for you, because as a result of these barriers to access, 22% of trans folks nationally report that they've avoided or postponed medical care because they have felt disrespected or feared discrimination from healthcare staff. And in Colorado, that number is even higher, between 24% and 42%, a huge range there of trans individuals who have avoided seeking care due to discrimination or stigmatization or even violence in some cases. And part of the reason for this much higher incidence of healthcare avoidance may be because of the geography of our state, in that while we have Denver in the Front Range, a large portion of our state is more rural, and it can be difficult for trans individuals in those rural communities to find inclusive healthcare either in their community or access it outside of their community. In terms of refusal, 29% of transgender patients nationwide have said a doctor has simply refused to see them because of their perceived gender identity. So about a third of transgender patients can't get access to healthcare even if they want it because the medical professionals refuse to see them. And in Colorado, again, even a higher number, a staggering 53% of trans patients have been refused medical care by medical professionals because of their trans identity. Again, most likely because of the unique geography of our state and the large portion of rural patients out there. And in terms of mistreatment, again, another third of transgender patients say that they've experienced unwanted physical contact, including sexual assault and rape. So if you think about this population who feels like they can't find inclusive healthcare, if they do find it, it's very likely that the medical professional will refuse to treat them. And even if the medical professional does accept treatment of them, it's possible, highly possible, that they will be assaulted in some way by that healthcare provider. Around 30.5% of transgender people nationally say it would be very difficult or not possible to find the same type of service at a different community health center, clinic, or hospital. So these are folks who, the argument of, well, if that doctor doesn't like you, or if that doctor is being inappropriate, go somewhere else. Well, over 30% say there's nowhere else to go. I don't have other access. I have to keep seeing this medical professional who's discriminating against me or assaulting me in the context of my health care. And in Colorado, 11% of trans individuals have traveled more than 100 miles to seek LGBTQ friendly services. So again, because of our rural mountain communities lacking in LGBT friendly providers, most LGBT folks outside of the Denver metro area have to travel to the Denver metro area to find friendly providers in more than 100 miles. And so it's very clear that access to healthcare for this community is a huge problem and something that we really have not found the solution to as of yet. We do a lot of training with medical professionals, helping them to become more inclusive, but there's been a lot of damage done to the trans community through medical professionals that needs to be remedied. And until that happens, several trans folks in our communities will simply go without medical care because of these issues. From the legal perspective, access to justice also remains critically low for the people who need legal services the most. Access to justice is a problem for all Americans, but for low-income individuals, for folks for whom English is a second language, for people of color, people experiencing homelessness, and undereducated folks, access to justice is disproportionately large for them. And for trans folks, most of the access to justice problems lie in areas of employment and housing law. So from an employment perspective, because of sort of rampant job discrimination, nearly 50% of transgender people report that they've been fired, denied employment, or denied promotion because of their gender identity. Now, in the United States right now, we don't have a federal protection toward trans individuals when it comes to employment discrimination, and so we have to take this discrimination issue from a state-by-state case. Here in Colorado, we do have workplace protections for transgender individuals, but unfortunately, it's not something that is well reported. A lot of folks don't know their rights, don't know when they've been discriminated against. It's very hard to prove that you were denied employment or denied a promotion solely because of your transgender status. And so because of that, even in Colorado, where we have really protective employment discrimination laws for LGBT folks, for the trans community, they're still twice as likely to be unemployed and to have a lower household income because of that discrimination, and because of the difficulty in proving discrimination and finding legal representation to proceed in litigation or to seek remedy for that discrimination. From a homelessness perspective, 1 in 5 transgender individuals have experienced homelessness at some point in their life. Again, because of rampant discrimination in employment, it's hard for them to find jobs and keep jobs and be successful in the workforce. And so sometimes they end up experiencing homelessness, and also because of discrimination in housing. Where we have landlords refusing to rent to trans individuals or raising rents unfairly to trans individuals. So several of them do experience homelessness at some point in their life. In Colorado, 14% of trans respondents experienced homelessness in the past year because of their gender identity. And whether that stems from employment issues or housing issues can be further broken out. But unfortunately, we still in Colorado, despite our protective laws, have a high number of trans homeless population because of a lack of access to justice in the housing and the employment areas. So you're a lawyer who wants to help the trans community in these areas. You want to fix this access to justice problem. You understand that it's there. You want to be an ally. You want to engage with this community and be inclusive of them. This is utilizing access to justice, improving access to justice for trans folks is really a great way to really help this population. And in order to do that, we want to make sure that when you're working with this population, you're utilizing welcoming and inclusive language and communication. And so we're going to discuss now best practices and what to say and not to say when you're communicating with and about the transgender community. So I have this handy chart here that walks you through a couple of terms that you may hear other people use. You may use them yourself, but we've tried to identify terms that we hear fairly often and find that good-intentioned people, well-intentioned people still utilize some of these terms, even though they're actually no longer appropriate to use. So at the top there, transgenders, transgendered, transgenderism. So what you'll see sometimes, especially in written form, is talking about the trans community or someone who is transgender as being transgendered. They add that ED or they add the S. So instead of saying that, we just want to say transgender person or trans folks or something like that. And the reason for that is that transgender is an adjective. It's not a noun or a verb. So transgender is not something that happens to you. You don't become, transgendered, just like we wouldn't call someone who identifies as gay. We wouldn't say that they became gayed over time or whatnot. You just are or you are not. And so we use just transgender without the added S, ED, or isms on it whenever we're referring to the trans community. And sometimes what you'll see in written form is trans with a little asterisk next to it. And I get questions sometimes from folks about what does that mean? And in that case, the person who's writing trans with the asterisk is trying to be inclusive of everyone under that trans umbrella. So when we use that asterisk, it's really meaning everyone under the umbrella, the whole community, not just the transgender community in the truest sense of the word transgender. Hermaphrodite, we spoke about this a little bit earlier. It is a medical term. We do see this term still in medical journals and things like that. But from a common communication, common culture aspect, we don't want to use the term hermaphrodite anymore. It does refer to an intersex person, so please use the term intersex person. Hermaphrodite has become stigmatizing over time, and it's simply not used anymore outside of the medical context. And we're even seeing most medical professionals move away from it as well. But just because you still see it out there in some of the things you read or hear doesn't mean it's the appropriate term to use. Please use intersex. The word transvestite. So transvestite has often been used as a negative slur toward the transgender community here in the US. It really means crossdresser. I think there's a misconception that transvestite means transsexual, and it does not. It actually means crossdresser. And so if it's okay to use the term crossdresser, there are people who do identify as crossdressers and do so very proudly. And so it's fine to use the term crossdresser, but we don't use the term transvestite here in this country anymore because it has become a harmful slur. That being said, if you travel frequently to Europe, especially the UK, you'll see the word and hear the word transvestite used very commonly over there. Different culture, different society, different meaning for them. But here in the US, it's not appropriate to use that term. The next two boxes here, he, she, shim, she-male, tranny, trap, these are just simply derogatory terms all together. And so we hope that you've never used these terms and never would. And so this is really more for your education. If you hear other people utilizing these terms, to please correct them and to stand up and be a good bystander for the trans community and not allowing these terms to be utilized. So he, she, or shim, these really came from folks trying to combine pronouns for trans individuals. So for someone who may identify as trans and asks you to utilize pronouns that are not in alignment with their sex assigned at birth, sometimes what people will do is just combine the pronouns and say it's a he, she, or it's a shim. And so what we want to do is make sure that we're utilizing the pronouns that someone has asked us and instructed us to utilize. And if we don't know what those pronouns are, to utilize gender neutral pronouns such as they, them, or their, and not to just combine the two binary pronouns in a derogatory way. It is mocking to utilize these terms, and so when in doubt, utilize gender neutral pronouns. And if you have been told by someone which pronouns they use those pronouns. And then finally at the bottom, these derogatory terms, she-male, tranny, trap, just should not be used at all. Again, if you're talking about a transgender individual, use transgender, use trans with the asterisk, use trans person, whatever you want to do there, as long as we're utilizing the appropriate term and not a hate term. Okay. So now looking at best practices for creating a safe and empowering experience when you're working directly with transgender clients. Of course, utilizing the language that we just discussed is important, but knowing what we know about the fear that the trans community has about accessing healthcare services, the fear of accessing legal services, when they walk into your office or they have an interface with you or your office in any way, it's important that we're focusing not just on language, but just about best practices and how to interact with the trans community in an inclusive way. So again, a handy chart for you here. On the left-hand side, we have the best practice we'd like you to incorporate into your work, and we'll talk about why these are the best practices and give you some examples that you could use. So the first one is just to avoid using gendered language whenever you can. I know we were all raised to be polite, to use sir and ma'am, and language such as that whenever we're meeting someone new or interacting with someone from a customer service perspective. Think about when you go out to dinner and the server asks for your order. Usually they'll say, "And what will you have, sir?" or "What can I get you, ma'am?" or "Good afternoon, ma'am," "Good afternoon, sir." But the problem with this gender language is that it forces the person using it to make an immediate assumption about someone's gender identity. Again, maybe based on their gender expression, what they're wearing, how they look, or based on their biological sex, should that be known to the person who's utilizing this gendered language. And because we don't want to make assumptions, because we really can't see gender identity unless someone's told us their gender identity, the best practice is to avoid using gendered language altogether. It really exemplifies mindfulness, that not to make assumptions, that you recognize that there are more gender identities than just the binary. Because if you think about it, utilizing sir or ma'am is still a binary way of assigning gender to someone. And so just utilizing non-gendered language, you've noticed probably over the course of our talk today that I've used the word folks a lot of times. That's really my go-to gender neutral language. Sometimes people will say y'all, but it's really important to just avoid that sir, ma'am, or he or she if you have not been told by somebody what their gender identity is or which pronouns they would like you to use. And so when someone comes in, just utilizing "How may I help you today?" And not "Good afternoon, sir. What can I do for you?" Things like that. Utilizing they instead of he or she, and then utilizing spouse or the person's name altogether. If you're not sure about gender identity or pronoun use, it's okay to just use their name instead of assigning a pronoun to them. So on that note of if you're not sure and you need to know, how do we ask that? How do we know and find out what someone's pronouns are? It's okay to ask. This takes practice. It's not natural for us to meet someone, introduce ourselves, and ask about pronouns, or to tell someone our own pronouns. But I will tell you that it is much better to ask someone and have them feel a little bit offended that you ask than to make an assumption and offend them by utilizing the wrong pronouns or the wrong name that they would like used. And so start practicing this. And the best way to do that is to do it for yourself. So the next time you introduce yourself, follow this lead. "Hi, my name's Ryan. I use they, them pronouns. How about you?" And that'll start the conversation. It gets you thinking about pronouns. It gets them thinking about pronouns. And it's good practice for asking someone about their pronouns and incorporating it into your everyday conversation. So when you politely ask, it really does illustrate an awareness and open-mindedness to the fact that you may be communicating with a transgender or a gender diverse person. When we don't ask about pronouns, it really shows an assumption that we already know. I don't have to ask your pronouns because I can just guess that it's probably this pronoun or that pronoun. And so how do you do this? Well, I gave you an example of introducing yourself in that way. But if you don't need to introduce yourself and you've already started a conversation and you want to circle back to it, it's as simple as, "What name and pronoun would you like me to use?" And that person will tell you about that. Why are we talking about names? Well, it's important to remember that for some trans individuals, they have taken on a chosen name as opposed to the name that was given to them at birth. Well, why is this? Well, because when they were born, their parent or caregiver, based on the sex that they were assigned, likely gave them a name that was in alignment with that sex. So, if their sex assigned at birth was male, maybe they received, a name like Steve or Mark or something like that. And if they were assigned female, maybe they were assigned the name of Barbara or Jessica or something like that. And so over time, as they come into their own gender identity, they may choose to leave that name behind and take on a different name, a chosen name. And what that will create sometimes when it comes to interacting with healthcare professionals or with legal professionals It's this concept of that given name, or sometimes what their legal name might be versus what their chosen name is. And while there's not much that you as a provider or practitioner can do about that distinction, if they have not legally changed their name to their chosen name, you can't do much about that distinction. It may be that for insurance purposes or for legal purposes, you have to utilize that legal name in some settings. What you can do as a provider or a practitioner is make sure that the interaction about that distinction of name is not awkward or discriminatory toward that person. So if you're in a situation where you have to understand both names, it's important to be respectful about asking about that. So there are a number of ways not to do it. The way not to do it is to say, what's your legal name or what's your real name? Because that automatically undermines that person's chosen name and forces them to be in a place, where that name they left behind, now that's the only name that they can be known by in their interactions with you. And so if you have that distinction between a chosen name and a given name or a legal name, it's important to help that individual understand that for purposes of the work that you need to do together, whether that be legal work or insurance work, that legal name is necessary, but that for all communication around your office and in your relationship with them as a practitioner or a provider, that their chosen name is absolutely the name that they will be known by within your office and within your interactions, and that legal name is really only used when necessary, as necessary, because there are just certain points about those names that we can't avoid. So making sure they understand that and feel comfortable and confident that even though their legal name or given name must come into play, that for your purposes, and for your purposes in your relationship with them, that their chosen name is absolutely the name that they will be known by and will be utilized. So that's a lot. It's a lot for people who are new to this, who are new to working with this community. It's a lot to remember pronoun usage. It's a lot to remember not to make assumptions. It's a lot to remember this concept of chosen name versus given name. And so what's going to happen at some point is we're all going to mess up. Even those of us who are a part of the community and work with the community all the time mess up on occasion. And so it's important to know that when you mess up, to just politely apologize. Don't sweep it under the rug, but also don't make it worse. You don't have to keep trying to dig yourself out of that hole. Simply apologize and move on. And apologizing really just shows your accountability and willingness to learn. Sometimes you'll catch yourself and can apologize. Sometimes you won't catch it, and that person you're interacting with may correct you. In either case, simply apologize and move on. And we have an example here of, I apologize for using the wrong name, or I apologize for using the wrong pronoun. I didn't mean to disrespect you. And then move on. Just acknowledging that that a mistake was made is going to help everybody to learn and grow, and it is natural for that mistake to happen. And then finally, remember that you only need to ask for information that is required for the work that you're doing. We want to make sure that just because we're working with the trans community doesn't mean that they're under any obligation to tell us anything about their medical journey, to tell us anything about their anatomy, about their body, unless it's required as part of the work we're doing together. So for healthcare providers, certainly there's probably going to be a need to understand some of the medical history or anatomical body history as well. But for legal practitioners, probably not at all. And so it's important that you don't utilize your work with the trans community to ask questions that you wouldn't ask of any other client, that are simply not appropriate. It's important to show respect for everybody's personal privacy, and make sure that as you're working with this community, you understand very clearly what you need to know versus what you want to know. And then for the things that you need to know, thinking about how you can ask those things in a sensitive way, so that it does not make that person feel as though they are in a vulnerable position, or as though they're going to be hurt or abused. We saw that statistic around the number of transgender folks who are actually assaulted by medical practitioners. So it's important to keep that in the back of your mind and know that even though these may be topics of conversation that are necessary as part of your work together, that doesn't mean it's an open-ended invitation to be touched or examined in a way that is not appropriate. Okay, so some common pitfalls. Where do we see practitioners getting into trouble when it comes to working with this population? One, sometimes we see practitioners talking about transgender people in a different way than they would with anybody else. So, trying to do too much in terms of not messing up pronouns or names, or speaking about the transgender community in a derogatory way, even though they work with them. So it's important that you speak the same way with trans folks as you would with anybody else, making sure that the dialogue is open, that you're treating them with respect, that you're not asking inappropriate questions, and really just treating them in an equitable way. Referring to a trans person's chosen name instead of referring to a trans person's name assigned at birth instead of the chosen name. When that happens, we call that dead naming. So if you are working with an individual who has a given name or as a name assigned at birth and they have moved to a chosen name, when you utilize that name assigned at birth in an inappropriate way, you are essentially dead naming them. And that is not only disrespectful, but under Colorado's Public Accommodations Act, it can be a form of discrimination. Not utilizing a trans person's chosen name or pronouns when speaking about them when they're not present. So the way that we keep ourselves from making a lot of mistakes is to train our brain. And you can't train your brain if you are speaking about someone differently when they're not in the room. So for instance, if when your trans client is with you, if you are utilizing their chosen name and their pronouns when they're with you, but when they're not with you, utilizing their assigned name or their your assumed pronouns or assigned pronouns, that you're not going to be able to train your brain. And what's going to happen is it's more likely you're going to make a mistake. So it's important that whatever name and pronouns that person utilizes, you use them in any conversation about them, whether they're in the room or not. And it's important to address your colleagues if they are falling into any of these traps. It's important to be that upstander, that bystander for your clients and for the community. And so if you hear colleagues or other clients utilizing wrong names and pronouns or making insensitive comments about the trans community, it's important that you stand up and say something. And then finally, it's important to only discuss someone's gender identity and sexual orientation with those who need to know. Again, simply because you're working with this community doesn't mean that you have the right to out anybody as part of the trans community or as part of the LGBT community as well. Whether you're a healthcare professional or a legal practitioner, sexual orientation and gender identity is a very private thing for many people, and simply because you have that information doesn't mean that you are at liberty to share that information with anyone who doesn't need to know. Okay. So one of the easiest places to do a really great job with the community or do a really bad job with the community is through your intake and sign-in forms. And so we have here an example of a really inclusive intake form, as this is usually the first place that a member of the trans community will interact with your office. That intake form means everything. I will tell you, as a genderqueer person, there are offices that I have walked out of because the intake form didn't have a place for me, on it. And so if the intake form didn't have a place for me, I certainly didn't see myself as being a client of that office in any way. And so I found another place to go. That's certainly a privilege that I have that not a lot of other folks have, as we've seen from those statistics. But if this is a community you truly want to work with, you truly want to be inclusive of, it has to start with your intake form. So you'll see here on page 1 of the intake form, we have the name on the insurance card or the ID, and then we also have a place for chosen name. And so for someone like me whose ID has my name assigned at birth on it, and that's different than my chosen name. It's different than the name that I want, to be known as in my interaction with that office. This form is helpful because it gives the information for both. So you would know what that name on the ID is, what the legal name or what the given name might be, but you also know what the chosen name is, so that you can put the given name where it needs to go, but utilize the chosen name in all of your interactions. It also asks for pronouns because, again, we don't want people to make assumptions. And so for someone like me who utilizes they, them, their pronouns, even though my sex assigned at birth is female and my gender identity is genderqueer, it's important that that your form asks about pronouns, so that when you're speaking with that person or speaking about that person, you're utilizing the pronouns that they've asked you to use. So on the next page, we are talking about sex and gender. So in a lot of intake forms, what you'll see is either just the question about are you male or female. It doesn't designate that as sex or gender. So we'll either see just that question, male or female, that's it, or we'll see all of these terms mushed into one question. And usually it's a question about sex. What is your sex? And it'll ask male, female, man, woman, trans, male, all the way down, all the way through. And so it's important on your intake form that you actually break out the notions of sex and gender identity. This is more important for healthcare providers than it is for legal practitioners, because sex assigned at birth for most legal issues may not be relevant. It could be if it's an employment discrimination or housing discrimination case or something like that, where needing to prove the transgender status of someone is important. But again, that's a place where you want to ask, what do I need to know versus what do I want to know? And so sex assigned at birth, obviously there's only two options there, but then giving a whole slate of gender identity options for folks so that they can choose the one that best fits them. And there are even more here that you could use from that umbrella slide if you wanted to, but these are the ones we see most often when we're asking about gender identity. All right. And then we want to ask about sexual orientation in a separate category as well. Sometimes we'll see sexual orientation conflated with gender identity. So you might see a question on a form that says, do you identify as part of the LGBT community? Do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? And the problem with that, as we now know from our shared language here, is that transgender is about gender identity. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation. And so we need to take all conversation about transgender out of the sexual orientation box and put it in the gender identity box, and then ask a separate question about gender identity that asks the terms that we went through earlier: straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, or something else. So with that, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information will be at the end here. You're welcome to email us, to call us with questions. I hope that this has been helpful to you as you get to know this community a little bit more, have some best practices at your fingertips. This is really just a taste of how you can begin working with this community in an inclusive way. We really hope that we can provide more information and services to you. Just remember that Range Consulting is a social enterprise of the Center on Colfax, and it is our workplace training program. We're happy to come to you and train your organization, consult with you, consult with your organization, especially leaders, organizational leaders, HR professionals, and the like, on how you can create an organization that is inclusive of the LGBTQ population. But thank you so much for joining us. We hope this has been helpful, and we'll see you next time.